Hello there everyone. Today I want to share with you a bit more detail about the wire that I used in most of my tutorials and also where I buy it, because I get a lot of questions about where I buy my wire and what kind of wire it is, so I just thought I would address it with this video. And here I just have a small selection of some of the wires on the reels, both in copper and silver finish, and I'm just going to be going through the gauges that I use and what they're good for, and then also the different colours that you can get. Now these are all the gauges in the silver colour that I'm going to be going through with you first, but before I do that I just want to tell you a little bit about where I buy them. Because all the wires that I'm going to be showing you today I bought from the same place. And that place is jewelrymaker.com, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link in the description box to the website so you can go straight there and have a look if you want to. And what I'm also going to do is put a code in the description box, so if you're a first time customer and when you make your very first order, you can use that code, and what you'll get is you'll get £10 credit on your account that you can then use for the future. So if you're a new customer, that's definitely a nice added bonus there. And so just to tell you a little bit more about the company itself, now it's called jewelrymaker.com, and obviously that means they provide jewelry making supplies, but actually they are part of a bigger company that's called the Genuine Gemstone Company. So for that reason they also provide many different gemstones that you can buy on strands, so use in your own jewelry making, and I definitely get a lot of my gemstones from there as well. And they have a nice big and wide selection of different gemstones, both the normal and more accessible ones like quartz and agate, but they also have more high-end gemstones as well, so you can really get many different things that you might be looking for. But like I said, today I'm just going to be focusing on the wire and telling you a little bit more about that because I get many questions about the wire that I use. So they are a UK based company, so they obviously ship within the UK, but they also ship to many other countries around the world, so it's just worth having a look if you're interested to see if they're shipped to your country. So that was a little bit of background on the company itself, and like I said, this is where I buy my wire at the moment, and I plan to keep buying this wire because I really think it's very good quality wire, and I love the fact that it comes in these large reels so it'll last you a lot longer. You don't have to be so worried about using it up and then running out in the middle of a project, for example. I am planning on trying other wires from other places as well in the future, but at the moment this is what I'm using and I'm very happy using this, and I do very highly recommend it. So now to talk a little bit more about the wire itself. And as you can see here, this is all the silver wire that I have, and this is all the gauges that they have available to purchase. And this is by far the metal colour that I use the most. Silver is and always will be my favourite, but I have recently started using a lot more copper as I've really grown on that colour as well. But the silver is what I'm still going to be using the most, but I will show you the copper a bit later on as well. Now what this wire is actually made of, all these wires are all the same, and it's the same with the copper, and all the other coloured wires they have as well you'll find on the website. The only difference in the finish is the colour of them, but the base of the wire is exactly the same. And what it is that it's a copper based wire, and then what they've done is, on top of the copper base, they've then coated it with sterling silver, so a layer of sterling silver, which is what you can see here, and then after that they put on an E-coating, and that's a coating that's going to help make it hypoallergenic, so most people won't react to it, but also it's going to help prevent tarnishing, which can sometimes be quite a big problem with metals in general. And I personally do feel that is very nice wire, and the E-coating works just the way that it says. I haven't had anyone, including myself, react to it as of yet, so there's no reaction to it because of the E-coating, whereas there would be maybe on some copper wire or something else. And also, none of the wire that I've had, and I've had some of it for a long time, none of it has tarnished yet. And even the finished pieces that I've made as well, right from the beginning when I started doing it, none of them had tarnished either. Because that is really one of the worst things. If you put a lot of work and effort into making something, and then shortly after you've made it, it starts tarnishing. So that can be really annoying, but I haven't found that with this wire at all. That's not to say that it's not ever going to tarnish in the future, but the E-coating really helps it to go a lot longer before it starts tarnishing. And so far, none of my pieces that I've had for a long time have tarnished. So that's what the wire is made of, and the only difference between the silver colour here and the other colours, so both the copper, the gold, and then the other actual colours as well, is that it's the same base, so it's a copper base, and then they're all coated with sterling silver, so like here, but then here they've just stopped with that and then added the E-coating. With the other ones, they have the base of the copper, and then the coating of sterling silver, and then they put on whatever colour the wire is. So if it's a black wire, they put on the black coating. If it's gold, they do the gold. and then the e-coating after that. So that's the only difference. With the silver, they've just stopped with the sterling silver layer. And I really think that has a lot to do with how shiny and bright the wire is, both the silver but also the other colours, so like the copper and even the gold as well. You can really see that shininess and how nice and bright it is as well. But now to go through the gauges with you a little bit, and then some of my favourite things to use the different gauges for. So to start from one end, up here I have the two largest gauges that they do in this wire, and these only come on these smaller reels. I'm also going to talk about the sizes of the reels. I'm going to do that afterwards. But these are 10-meter reels, and it's only because the wire is so thick that it's going to be harder to put on these 50 or 100-meter reels. But I'm going to be going through it as I go. This first one is a 1.5mm wire, so that's the diameter of the wire. And then the one below here is a 1.25. So these two are quite thick wires, and you'll find they're brilliant wires and I use them for a lot of different things, but they're kind of better for certain things rather than some of the other wires here. So these are kind of obviously structural wires, and they're quite a lot harder to work with than say even the 1mm, so the malleability of it is a little bit different. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, because they're still quite malleable, especially considering the thickness of them, but it is harder to work with than it is for the other gauges that you use. So what I just want to do as I go through the gauges as well is show you some of the things that the wires are really good for and that I prefer to use them for. Now these two that I just told you about, so the two larger gauges here, so the 1.5mm and the 1.25, quite often I use these for very similar things because they are that substantial gauge and they're kind of more of a framework. So I often use them for the same things or similar things. The only difference between these is the 1.25 can sometimes just be a little bit preferable because it can just be a little bit more malleable than the 1.5mm. But then other times you really want that full-on strength from the 1.5mm, so both really can be used for very similar things, but also sometimes one is just a little bit preferred over the other one. And now just to show you some examples of something that I've made with them. I've made these rings, and this is with a 1.5mm, and this is where you can see this is just wire where I've made rings, and these are adjustable rings, all of them. It's all the same base ring. These two I've just added gemstones to. So there isn't any weaving on these. I've only weaved the gemstones onto the frame. I've not actually used the weaving to help hold the frame together and give it more strength. So that's why I've used the thicker gauge for this, because you can really feel the strength in the ring. Even though it's adjustable, it's got a real strength to it, so it's not going to move while you're wearing it at all. It's going to stay where you want it to stay. So that's why I used the 1.5 for these. Now you could also easily use the 1.25 for these rings and it'll be basically the same result. So that's really just personal preference. And also maybe the 1.25 will be a little bit easier to make the swirls with because it's just a little tad bit more malleable. But these ones I just made with the 1.5. So either will really work for these rings. It's just to give you an idea of why I used that wire for those, and it's because of the strength of that wire, because it's just that one length of wire holding itself, whereas other rings that I'm going to be showing you later on, I've used a smaller gauge of base wire, but then I've used a wrapping wire to help give it extra strength, but I haven't done that on those rings. And then another example, and this is for the 1.25mm gauge, and it's this. So this is my microcrame tree of life. So the main part of this design is a microcrame, so cord. But what I've done is I've used the wire to make the frame for it. So to make the frame first, to then macrame it onto. And that's why I wanted to use, again, a larger gauge to give it that strength. So when you're wearing it, it's not just going to bend out of place. It has a real strength to it. But I used the 1.25 because I wanted to make the wrap loop up here. And I thought that would just be a little bit easier with the 1.25 than the 1.5. But again, you could quite easily use the 1.5. Just making sure that you can do your wrap loops and your bends that you need to do. I just thought that would be a little bit easier with the 1.25. So those are the two largest gauges of wire, and they're quite substantial and quite often just used as a base wire, either on its own or just to give something a real strength to the frame. And the next reel that I have here, this is the 1mm gauge, and this is definitely one that I use a lot as well. Probably one of the ones that I use the most actually. Because this is a bit of an all-around wire. Again, it's nice and thick in the sense that it's a larger gauge, but it's not quite as thick as those. So you can use it for, again, many of the same things as those, but still it's a bit more malleable. So I also want to be careful not to use it for everything that I use them for. So I wouldn't use this for, say, the framework for my tree, because it's just a little bit too malleable for that. But otherwise you can quite easily use it for rings and things. And again, this is just a really nice base wire for framework. So what I would use this for is really many different things. I would also, most often, I would pair it up with another gauge, but I'll get to that once we get to that gauge. What I'm going to show you now is just some things where it's more the 1mm here, that's the feature. So say for instance this ring, again this is just the 1mm, and it's kind of an adjustable ring, but not quite in the same way. And this is a 1mm that I've also hammered, so the hammering gives it again more strength and stability. But there is definitely more movement and malleability to this than the other rings that I showed you before with the larger gauges. So it doesn't mean that you can't do rings with this, but these are a little bit more stable and substantial, so it's a matter of personal preference. So the ring that I just showed you, made with this wire, is just this wire on its own, but mostly when I use the 1mm here for rings is when I'm also doing weaving onto the rings, so that's also to help the strength and stability of the ring. But like I said, I'm just going to show you a few more examples of them a bit later on when we get to the weaving wire that I often use for that as well. So another example where I've only used this wire on its own and no other wire like weaving wire is this. And this is where I've wrapped a cabochon, and I've made a 5-strand braid and just wrapped it with that to secure it in place, and I've only used a 1mm for this. Now you could also easily do this with a different gauge, say the 0.8, but in this case I just used the 1mm, and it really all depends what look you want, but also what size cabochon you've got. And I just thought a 1mm would fit nicely with this. So that's another thing, you can easily use the 1mm on its own as well as with other wires. So for the next example, I've also used this wire on its own, but I've used it as a frame. So like my micro macrame tree of life that I just showed you with the larger gauge, it's the same principle, but what I've done is I've used it for these earrings. So as you can see, you can easily use it as framework, and I've also macrameed onto this, so it's plenty good enough for that. I just didn't want to use it for the micro macrame tree of life, because here you can see the circumference is a lot smaller, so it can support itself more easily, whereas the tree of life is larger, so there's a lot larger diameter that it needs to support itself, and the larger gauges are just a bit better for that than the 1mm. But you can easily use it for things like this. So I've made all the components of this 1mm wire and then macrameed onto it, so you can quite easily use it for these things as well. So the last example that I have for this wire right now is this necklace that I made. So the purpose of this wire is a little bit multi-purpose. As you can see, it's a necklace made micro macrame all the way around. But what I did first is I used this 1mm wire to create this whole frame piece where I've then macrameed onto. So it's working fine for that. But I've made all these individual components, and then I've used the 0.4mm wire that I'm going to explain to you later on to wrap them together. So I have used some wrapping for this, but it's in a bit of a different way. I've only used it to be able to connect the pieces together. And then it holds itself really nicely. There's a bit of movement to it, but it's really nice and stable, strong enough for it, and also to macrame it onto. And I also wanted to use the 1mm wire for this because, as you can see, I've added beads to the wires here in between in different places, and the reason that I had to use a 1mm as well is I've actually put the 1mm through those beads, so they're not wrapped onto it with the 0.4mm wire, they're actually on the 1mm wire, and the hole in those are just not large enough for, say, some of my thicker wire to go through. So that's another reason why I use the 1mm wire. Often you can then get, if you want to add beads to your pieces, the 1mm wire will go through more pieces, or more beads rather, than the thicker gauges, which you probably won't get many beads onto those thicker gauges. So the next gauge of wire here is the 0.8mm, and in some ways it can act quite the same as a 0.1mm, but the difference is, again, kind of like these two, there's just that slight difference in the malleability, but also if you want to add beads, you can add more beads to this because it's a bit thinner, but still it is strong enough to also create a framework for your pieces. For instance, in these pieces, I used 0.8mm as the base wire instead of the 1mm. I could have chosen to use that, but I wanted the extra malleability and a little bit more finer gauge of wire than the 1mm, because as you can see I've also written a word here, and I thought that would be more easily achievable with the 0.8mm, and you could get it even finer and smaller, because the 1mm, it might have to make it a little bit larger, and you couldn't get kind of your bends and your twirls quite as nice and fine. So that's why I use the 0.8mm for the base of this all the way around, and it's also just a bit easier to work with, I find. And the same with these, the earrings that I made. The hat itself is also the 0.8mm. The arrow is a different kind of gauge, both two different gauges, but the hat is the 0.8mm as well, and then wrapped with 0.4mm. And also, if you can see the loops here at the top, they're more easily achievable because you just have that slightly finer gauge of wire than the 1mm. But still, because I then have the 0.4mm to wrap around my base wires of the 0.8mm, here I've actually got two wires running through the hats all the way around, and because I'm wrapping with the 0.4mm, it gives it a really nice strength, so you won't really, this will not go out of shape unless you force it out of shape. So it's still strong enough, especially when you also wrap with a weaving wire. And then I've also used the 0.8mm for this that I made. So this is like a locket that I made of wire, and then a little key here. You then open up, and I just put a picture in there. And on the back again, I have a little bit of white writing, just some initials, and then all the swirls and that. So I found that just the 0.8mm was also better to use for this, because I'm also doing a lot of wrapping, which will help strengthen the piece. But the 0.8mm is fine enough that you can get a lot of detail in there. So I use the 0.8mm for this as well. And then another thing that I like using 0.8 for as well is because we've moved down in the gauges a little bit rather than the high gauges over here, you can also use it for macrame. So wire macrame, which I like to try and experiment with as well. So this is a wire macrame bracelet that I made. This is just kind of wrapping around the beads, but on the back side here I've made little macrame parts with the wire, and this is the 0.8mm wire. Now obviously it's not as easy as, say, an even smaller gauge to do macrame with, but it is definitely possible with a little bit of strength, but also just some practice really, and then you get a really nice and neat finish. So I do also like using the 0.8 for this, because it has that little bit extra malleability to it than, say, the 1mm. And the next gauge that I have down here, moving one gauge down, is the 0.6mm. So now this gauge of wire is quite multi-purpose on its own as well, I think, because I use it for quite a few different purposes. Now I will sometimes use it as framework, but obviously we've moved down a fair few gauges now, so this is a lot softer and a lot more malleable, so it's not going to hold its shape on its own as much. But I do use it for framework, but then often I will then wrap it with the 0.25mm, and I have a few examples, but I'm going to show you them a bit later on when we get to here, because this wire is so fine that it works with the 0.6mm. But otherwise I also sometimes use it on its own. But then what I've done is I've used it in some of my bracelets, and I'm going to show you some, but I haven't used it just, say, one length of wire on its own. So say in this bracelet, this is really substantial, and it takes a lot to get this out of shape. You're not really going to get it out of shape unless you're purposely trying to proper bend it. But because, and the reason for this is because we have so many of that 0.6mm wire next to each other, and they're kind of weaving in and out, so that really gives it a lot of strength. So you can achieve that strength with this gauge of wire. You just need to kind of work with it in specific ways, but also at the same time, because it's that gauge, it makes it a lot more malleable and easier to shape into the shape that you want it to go, really. And it's the same with this bracelet. Now the one I just showed you, the weaving that I've done is really nice and close, so that's really tight together. But in this it's really open. But again, all the silver wire in this is the 0.6mm. The copper wire that I've added a feature of, that's a 0.4mm, but I've twisted two lengths of 0.4mm, but that's just an extra feature. You can easily just replace that with a length of 0.4mm again, 0.6mm, sorry. So, but as you can see, this is a lot more open weaving, but it still holds really nicely. And it's a little bit more shapeable, but it's still really nice and strong, so you can quite easily wear it as it is. And then say for this bracelet, I've kind of just used the 0.6mm as a feature. So this is what I've used for the crossovers on each bead. Now the center wire running through the whole bracelet, that's actually a 1mm, so that's this one, to give it that strength, because it's just one length running through the whole thing. But then I've kind of added a bit of strength to it, extra strength, but also just the design feature, and that's the 0.6mm that I wrap with. So you can actually also use your 0.6mm to wrap with. You just need to wrap it around the larger gauges of wire. And then obviously it won't be quite as fine a wrap, but it depends all on the look that you want. So the last example that I'm just going to show you with the 0.6mm is again a micro macrame tree of life, where I've used this as the frame. So they look like this. I've just made these into earrings. So this is the exact same technique as the larger one that I showed you before, but because I wanted them smaller so they would go for earrings rather than the other one is like a pendant size, I wanted, obviously the cords or threads that I'm using are a lot thinner, but then I also wanted the frame to be a lot thinner, because if I used the thicker gauges I thought it would kind of be out of balance and the frame would be too thick compared to the macrame part. So I used the 0.6mm to create the shape here, but you will obviously be able to bend this. But I thought because it's earrings, they're not going to move around as much as say a pendant, so they will hold, but also using the macrame all the way around, that helps kind of keep its shape because of all the knots in the cord that we've used as well. So it is possible to use it like this. It's obviously just a little bit more delicate. So now we're moving down another gauge of wire here, and we're now moving into what's kind of known as the weaving wires, because they're a lot finer and more often used to weave around your thicker gauges of wire. And in this case this is the 0.4mm, and this is probably the most common weaving wire that you will use, and I use this for probably most things as well, I would say. So quite often what you would do is use this as a weaving wire and say pair it with the 1mm. So some examples of that are these, and this is a ring that I made. So like I said, this is a 1mm wire as the base wire in this ring. It's going all the way around, and then I've used the 0.4mm to wrap with to give it extra strength but also detail, but then also to help add in more beads as I go. So you can easily, this is quite commonly used say to make rings together, where you then use this to weave with, but also other things as well. And here's a ring where I've also used the 0.4mm to wrap around 1mm. This is just a copper colour, but I've only used the weaving wire here around the ring band. So this is basically just to help keep these wires going around your finger to keep them together and give it extra strength. And then this I've just added with the 1mm wires that I've used throughout. And then the next ones, again I've used the 1mm and the 0.4mm to wrap together, and I've made a pair of earrings with this, and this is what they look like. So I've used the 1mm to create the basic shape of the earrings, but then I've used the 0.4mm basically, I've used to add in stones and beads to it. So that's also quite often used where you're using the 0.4mm to add beads and stones to whatever you're doing, to add more design and features to it, because obviously your 0.4mm will go through near enough all beads that you can get really, at least far most of them. So quite often you're also using this to just add more features into a design that you already have. And then another thing that this wire is quite often used for, and it's very useful for, again paired with this most often as well, is things like this. So wrapping capuchons. And this is using the netting technique. So this I just made it into a ring, and again I used the 1mm to band for the band as well. And you can make this adjustable. So using the 1mm for a ring, wrapping it with a 0.4mm, it's substantial enough to also make an adjustable ring, but also to hold in the cabochon. And then a pendant with the same technique, but just to show you that it's the 0.4mm here that I have around the sides to hold in the cabochon in place. So it's very often used for that as well, and very substantial enough for that, because you need the thinness of the wire to kind of get your detail and be able to weave and make your loops, and the malleability of it as well, so you can get nice even and curvy loops, but also it's strong enough once you kind of weave it together, it holds its shape really nicely and they're in there nice and secure. And then the last thing to show you that you can also use this for, this is where I've actually used it on its own, and you can quite easily use this for macrame. So wire macrame again, but obviously you just got to bear in mind that it's a finer gauge, so it doesn't hold itself up quite as well as say the 0.6 would for macrame, but in this case I have used it, and you can see that it does hold really nicely and it holds its shape, and you can wear it quite easily like this. It does have a tendency to bend a bit more if you purposely go and bend it. It's easier to do than say using the other gauges, the higher gauges, but at the same time it still does hold really nicely. Especially because what you're doing here is you're kind of knotting your wire in place, and that helps give it more strength as well. And also as you're working with it, it's work hardening it as well. So you can do this just as well as some of the other wires. It all really depends, because on this I wanted a finer look to the macrame than I did using the higher gauges. So it's really a matter of personal preference. And then now moving down to the very smallest gauge of wire here, and this is a 0.25mm wire. And now this can be a little bit scary to think to maybe work with, because it is so fine that you think it's going to break from almost just touching it. But actually it is stronger than you realise it is. And I do really like using this for a lot of weaving work that I do, because even though you can use the 0.4mm quite often for the same thing, the difference is between the 0.4 and the 0.25 is the 0.25 will give you a much finer detailed look to your pieces. And an example of this is this pendant that I made. Now this, I used my base wires running through the piece is the 0.6mm wire, and then I've used the 0.25 to wrap with. So that's why I've achieved this very delicate and fine look. If I'd gone up in the gauges, it would have looked completely different, and it would have probably also ended up being a bit larger. Because I used the fine gauges, I was able to kind of manipulate it exactly how I wanted it to be. So that's the benefit of using the 0.25 to wrap with. And also you can then pair it with the 0.6mm, which normally you couldn't really wrap onto then, because the 0.4mm is too thick to wrap onto the 0.6mm. So that's why I like pairing these two up, so the 0.6mm and 0.25, to achieve that much finer look to my weaving. And it's the exact same principle that I used for this ring. So I have some base wires running through the snake here, that's the 0.6mm. I've also got some 0.4mm, but again I use them on the outside and I twisted 2 lengths of 0.4, but the base wire really is the 0.6mm size there. And then I wrapped with my 0.25 to achieve a much finer and detailed look than I would do with the 0.4. And that's when I've been able to achieve nicer and more smaller curves really, and just a much finer detail to the piece than I would have otherwise. But obviously you just got to bear in mind that it is a much finer gauge, and you are going to be using more. It's going to take longer to wrap with this, weave with it, and also you're going to use more than you will say with your 0.4mm. But that's just something to bear in mind. But you can quite easily use these for very similar things, and also both of these gauges are actually quite good for crocheting with wire as well. Now that's not something I've personally done, but it is something that's really nice. And obviously both if you crochet with it or if you just weave with it, both of these gauges, you do have to be a little bit careful when you work with it, because it's nice and strong, both of them, and they will last. But if you get too many kinks or bends in your wires, it will snap after not too long, so you got to be careful with that. Especially the 0.25. If you get a kink or a bend in it, rather try and undo it and straighten it and save it before you just pull on it, because it will snap easy, a little bit more easily than say the 0.4mm wire will. But it is still nice and strong once you've used it. So that's all the different gauges of wire here, and I've gone through what I like to use each of them for and the different purposes that they have. So it's some nice little tips. If you are a beginner, it can help you understand what the different purposes of the different gauges of wire might be. But obviously everyone has their own preference, and people might have different purposes with some of this wire than what I've had. This is just my own little guideline as to how I like to use them and what might help you if you're just starting out. And also I just want to go over the size of the reels. Now you'll see these two are smaller reels and the rest of them are large reels. What you'll find on the large reels here, some of them are actually 100-meter reels and some of them are 50-meter. That's because some of these I've had for a while, and they used to do them in 100-meter reels, but they've gone now to do it in 50-meter reels. So when you go on the website, what they'll have is the 50 meters, which obviously is still a lot and it's going to last you a long time. So that's why some of them are 100 meters and some of them are 50. But like I said, if you go onto the website now, what you'll find is the 50-meter reels in all the colours that they have, and they'll look something like this. And now they also sell all their gauges in smaller lengths. So in these reels, so that's the 10-meter reels, and they look like this. These are just the large gauge ones, but all the others will come in similar type reels to this. And this can be quite useful, say if you want to travel with your wire, to have the smaller ones, or even if you want to try out a colour, or have a colour in your stash, but that one that you know that you don't use that often. So with me, I like having my silver and my copper in the large reels, and then some of the coloured wires I'll have in the smaller reels like that. so the 10-meter reels, because I know I don't use them as often as, say, I do my silver or my copper wire. So how you would want to buy them is completely up to you, but obviously the 50-meter reels are going to last you a lot longer, and it is also more cost effective in the long term. So I also just wanted to show you all the copper ones. Again, these are all the same gauges, so from the highest one, the 1.5mm, all the way down to the 0.25mm. So that's how these look, and as you can see they have a really lovely sheen to them, so they're really a bright copper here, but have a really nice tone as well. So that's what the copper ones look like. So like I said, it's the same basic wire, so it's a copper wire that's coated in sterling silver, and then it has a copper coating to get the colour that you want, and then it's coated with the E-coating as well. So that was just a run through of the wires that I use and where I buy them, and what I'm going to do on both, it's all the same with both the silver and the copper, they're from the same place, so I'm going to put all the necessary information in the description box like I said, but otherwise I really hope that this was helpful for you, and that you can go and have a look if you want to have a look where I get the wires from. So I really do recommend these wires if you have a chance to get hold of them. I highly recommend them because I use them all the time and I don't really have any problems with them. So otherwise, I really hope this was helpful, and thank you very much for watching. Hello there everyone. Today I want to show you how to do this wire wrap cabochon using a 5-strand braid. And this is what it looks like. So I'm just using an oval stone for this, but you can use other sizes and shapes as well. This is just an example. And then this is just a floret stone, and then you have a 5-strand braid on the side going all the way around, hugging it at the front to keep it in place.